Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on a figure who's been almost totally lost to history. This is the story of a man who took on one of the most radical, most controversial, and it turns out, one of the most influential translation projects ever.
So who actually decides what the Bible really says? I mean, that question feels so modern, right? But what if I told you it was at the very heart of an intellectual war that was raging nearly 2,000 years ago? We're talking about a battle over words, over meaning, and really over the very soul of a sacred text.
Okay, so let's set the scene. I want you to picture it. It's the 2nd century. The Roman Empire is pretty much at the peak of its power. And way over in the Eastern Mediterranean, there's this really high-stakes conflict brewing. It's between two major faith communities. You've got Rabbinic Judaism, which is trying to figure out what it is after its temple was destroyed, and then you have the early Christian church, which is just spreading like wildfire.
So, right at the center of this whole conflict was a book, or to be more specific, a translation of a book. See, for centuries, if you were a Greek-speaking Jew, the Bible you read was a version called the Septuagint. But here's the problem. By the 2nd century, the early Christians had totally embraced it. And Jewish communities were starting to feel like, hey, wait a minute, we're losing control over how our own sacred texts are being interpreted.
And the difference in how these texts were translated is absolutely key here. The Septuagint, it was a pretty fluent translation. It read well in Greek, but that sometimes meant being a little interpretive. And the early Christians found that its particular phrasing was super useful for backing up their own theological arguments. This, of course, left Jewish leaders in a serious bind. They realized they needed a new Greek version, one that was, without a doubt, 100% faithful to the original Hebrew.
So who's going to step up and take on this monumental task? Well, enter the most unlikely hero you could possibly imagine. A man born right into the heart of Roman power. Someone standing at the very crossroads of empires and faiths.
Okay, so this man's name was Aquila, and his life story it's just unbelievable. It's this wild journey across the entire spiritual map of the Roman Empire. So he starts out as a pagan Roman noble from a place called Pontus, which is in modern-day Turkey. And get this, he wasn't just any noble. He was actually related to the Emperor Hadrian. Yeah, that Hadrian. So from there, his spiritual search takes him to Christianity, but for whatever reason, it doesn't stick. He ends up leaving the church and converts completely to Judaism. This wild path he takes, from the inner circle of Roman power to becoming a devoted Jewish scholar, that's the key to this whole story.
But Aquila didn't just convert and call it a day. No way. He went out and sought the greatest Jewish minds of his time, and he ended up becoming a student of the legendary Rabbi Akiva. And it's from Akiva that he learns this completely revolutionary way to read the Bible, a method that treats the text not just as a collection of stories, but as a kind of divine code.
So, what was this code? Well, here's the absolute core belief he got from Rabbi Akiva. The Hebrew Bible was perfect, absolutely perfect. Not one single letter, not even a tiny grammatical particle was there by accident. Every single piece of that text was put there by God and carried these hidden layers of legal and theological meaning. So to change even one word, even just to make it a little clearer, meant you were risking losing a piece of that divine message.
Okay, and here's a perfect example of this whole idea in action. In Hebrew, there's this little particle et. Now, most of the time, it just kind of works like a grammatical signpost, pointing out the direct object of a verb. It doesn't really have a direct translation in English or Greek. But Rabbi Akiva taught that whenever you see et, it's secretly hinting that something else is being included in the action. So what did Aquila do? He insisted on translating et every single time with the Greek word soon, which means with. Now, the result was really bizarre, totally broken Greek grammar. But for Aquila, that didn't matter. Preserving the code was way more important than making a Greek grammarian happy.
So, armed with this whole philosophy, Aquila sets out on his mission. And what was that mission? To create a Greek translation that was a perfect one-to-one mirror image of the Hebrew text. He wasn't trying to make it sound pretty or poetic in Greek, not at all. He was literally trying to force the Greek language to behave like Hebrew, to preserve every single tiny nuance, every potential hidden meaning for all the Greek-speaking Jews out there.
And this example from the Book of Kings just shows his method perfectly. So, a normal, fluent translation of the Hebrew word lefanav would just be before him. Simple enough. But Aquila? He translates it as is prosopon outou, which literally translates to his face. Now that sounds really awkward and strange in Greek, right? But it's an almost mathematically precise reflection of the original Hebrew words. And that's his whole method in a nutshell, this beautifully awkward precision. But maybe his most radical choice of all was what he did with the name of God. See, other translations would take the four-letter Hebrew name, the Tetragrammaton, and just translate it as Kyrios, or Lord in Greek. Aquila did something, well, shocking. He didn't translate it at all. Instead, he wrote the name directly into his Greek text. But he did it using the ancient Paleo-Hebrew script, the writing style from hundreds of years earlier. It was a stunning visual reminder of the text's ultimate, untranslatable, holy source.
Now, it would be so easy to look at this and think, wow, this guy must have been really bad at Greek. But that would be a huge mistake. All the evidence points in the exact opposite direction. We know he was familiar with classical literature like Homer, he used a massive Greek vocabulary, and he even pulled out obscure Greek grammar tricks to try and mimic Hebrew structures. So the big takeaway here is that his awkwardness wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It was a deliberate, profound philosophical choice.
Okay, so just to recap, he creates this intensely, fiercely Jewish translation. It's specifically designed to be a counterargument to the version of the Bible that Christians were using, but what happens next? Well, it's one of the great ironies of history.
Because his translation was so incredibly hyper-literal, it ironically ended up becoming a priceless tool for his biggest theological opponents. First, the great Christian scholar Origen used it as a key resource for his massive side-by-side comparative Bible, the Hexapla. Then, about a century later, another guy, St. Jerome, relied on it heavily when he was creating the Latin Vulgate. And the Vulgate, that would become the standard Bible for all of Western Christianity for more than 1,000 years. And for centuries, that's how Aquila's work survived, just as quotes and footnotes in the works of other writers. It was basically lost. But then, in 1897, something incredible happened. In a synagogue storeroom in Cairo, scholars found actual physical pages from his original manuscript. It was a stunning discovery. It confirmed everything the ancient writers had said about him, and, even better, it gave modern scholars a direct window into what the Hebrew Bible looked like back in the 2nd century. It completely revolutionized the field.
You know, there's this really powerful legend recorded in the Talmud about Aquila trying to explain his conversion to his uncle, the Emperor Hadrian. The story goes that Hadrian had once given him some business advice. He said, go invest in the thing that is lowest, for it is sure to rise. Later, when Hadrian asked him why he chose Judaism, Aquila told him, I did what you said. I searched all the nations, and I found none so lowly as Israel, so I invested in them and their Torah, because I know they're destined for greatness. It's just this beautiful story that frames his entire life's work as the ultimate long-term investment.
So, Aquila's whole story really forces us to ask a pretty fundamental question, doesn't it? He believed that divine truth was literally embedded in the grammar of his sacred text. And it just makes you wonder, in our own lives, when we read a foundational text, whether it's a constitution or a scientific paper, or even a classic piece of literature, what crucial meanings might we be overlooking? What truths are hiding in plain sight, right there in the smallest of details?